migrating to Australia in the Salute Buongiorno boardroom. Today, David, we are speaking with someone who has a long history with both Australia and Singapore. And I'm really interested because I've been checking out a lot about Singapore in the last week. I'm Grant Williams.
It's a beautiful place, Grant. Singapore's a beautiful island, and we've got a force of nature. We've got a property expert, somebody who is an Australian and ex-Singaporean, wonderful Wendy Chong. How are you?
Hello, guys. Hi, Grant. Hi, David. Thank you for having me this afternoon.
Welcome aboard. Welcome aboard. Wendy, you've been in Australia, I think we worked out, what was it, 21
years?
Oh, 17 years.
No. No, I have been in Australia since 1999. That is like...
You became a citizen in 2005.
I became an Australian citizen in 2005. That's correct.
But the interesting thing that we were talking about while we were making some coffee is that the Australian government actually asked you to become a citizen. Now, that's quite different to what happens now.
Well, I was gobsmacked when I got the letter, the snail mail letter, the physical letter, not electronic letter, in the mailbox back in, I think it was like 2004, 2005. And they offered me a citizenship. And that was just really uncalled for. I never heard of that before. So, yes.
Did you have to do a test? Not even do a test. Everyone has to do a test these days.
No, not in those days. And I guess maybe they knew that English is the first language back in Singapore. Yes. No test at all.
Wonderful.
They gave it to me on a silver platter.
And these days when somebody applies for citizenship, if they're eligible, it's at least 2 years from start application to going up on stage, shaking the federal members and state members' hand and getting the certificate of citizenship. How long did the process take back then? Do you remember?
Oh, it was quite fast. Well, the moment I had that letter in my hand, and the next thing I knew, it was sometime in September 2005. I was standing right in the at St. George Square in Brisbane. I was living in Brisbane at that time. And I was amongst like 300 candidates there, and yeah, we were all like holding our certificate, shall I say, and it was bittersweet, I would say.
Bittersweet because your Singaporean passport was, you had to return it.
I have to renounce it because at that time Singapore do not encourage any dual citizenship, so I had to make a decision. And I took up the offer, Australia's offer. Yes.
It's a big decision. And are you happy with that?
I was, because I knew that I made that right decision for my family and, of course, with the blessing of my dad. So I was able to take that huge leap.
Wendy, I'm always interested in what people think about Australia when they first arrive compared to what they thought Australia would be like when they're looking through brochures or booking their ticket. So tell me, what was Australia as you first experienced it like compared to what you expected it to be?
Well, I was lucky enough that back in 1993, after I served the Singapore Armed Forces, I made the decision to spend my very first overseas holidays in Australia. So I came to Melbourne to spend a week here in Melbourne and 1 week in Tasmania. And it was absolutely gorgeous. And it was in June, winter. I experienced my very first snow up in the mountains. And so never really thought that I would come back to Australia or migrate to Australia in 99. So I thought, nah, that's it. I love Australia because I already had first-hand experience in that. So whenever we talk about Australia, when I was living in Singapore, it's not, all kangaroos and kangaroos hopping across the main roads. Or
still happens.
Maybe anti.
But do you tell people that now? Because that's my favourite thing to tell Americans.
No, I would probably say that you probably see a lot of possums. But no, it was just definitely, it was just the 12 apostles on the ocean road, the Great Ocean Road, that really attracted me to Australia. And so I migrated to Brisbane first for 14 years and then came to Melbourne 8 years ago.
Adapting to the climate, because Brisbane's just that little less humid, but still beautiful, warm weather like Singapore. You're in Melbourne, it's miserable weather one day, it's beautiful weather the next. How do you cope?
Oh, the first 2 months when I relocated to Melbourne, to be really honest with you, I plunged into Newtown blues. I plunged into a little bit of a depression there. But, in any way you go, you just need to adapt. Once you adopt the local, what do you call it, driving around the trams and the hook turns here in Melbourne, yeah, you'll be fine. You just have to really give yourself some time to get used to it.
We didn't have good coffee back then, Grant.
Oh, we did, but it was
Wasn't like
it was
these
harder
days.
to find. But listeners, hook turns are a uniquely Australian thing, except for a few select intersections in other cities. I'm sure, having come from Singapore, you probably handled hook turns better than anyone from Sydney. Actually, David, while we're on levity, how many of the 12 apostles are still there?
Do you know what? There's 10.
So isn't
Thank you, Wendy. Thank you,
isn't
Wendy.
that good? It's so Aussie, isn't it, that our major tourist attraction that, Wendy, you were really wanting to see is come and see our eroding stacks of rock that are disappearing into the sea.
I've been once. How many times have you been?
I've been heaps of times. I've driven down past there, but
Everybody who comes goes. It is a major
I love
major
Lockhart
attraction.
Gorge. Lockhart Gorge is amazing, and so is the story about the Lockhart. But
Well, another great attraction for overseas, like, my peers back in Singapore, would be the Sovereign Hill.
Oh, wow. Haven't been since I was a kid.
Yeah, well, there
Have
you go.
You
I've
would have
been
been
there.
as a kid
Yeah.
as well.
David, do you remember that Sovereign Hill ad where at the end of the ad there was a guy, a kid on a horse, and he looked back at the camera?
I remember the bald lolly shop. Do you remember the bald lolly shop? I don't remember the ad.
I went to school with that dude.
But that fascinates me. I mean, as a kid in the late 70s, early 80s, went to Sovereign Hill with my grandparents all the time. So you went as a young woman, and it's a verified tourist attraction for people from overseas.
And the thing is, it's all in also educating tourists of the Australia history, gold panning and how the settlers came during the gold rush and all that. So it is just a piece of history that they take away. So you don't go there just to kind of mimic how the gold miners did before, but you also get to see ladies wearing the
The bonnets and the big hoop dresses. And
yeah.
So for anyone who doesn't know what Sovereign Hill is, it's a historical sort of reenactment park. It's not the Wild West. It's set in a gold mining settlement in the 1830s, 40s, 50s, 60s, when Victoria was basically built on the profits of the gold that came out of the areas around Ballarat.
I think that's
No, Tandara was Emu Bottom.
Oh, okay. An old series in the 70s set in the same period. Now, Singapore, I love Singapore. I adore Singapore. People listening, I love it. A lot of people say they leave because they find it maybe a little repressive, a little bit hard to be an individual. It's organised, it's cleaner than here, the food is delicious, it's very expensive. What do you miss? What did you bring to Singapore? What do you miss from Singapore, and what did you bring from Singapore to Australia?
Well, every single time I go back to visit my family, I will always go for the chili crabs.
Food.
I miss the food. It's
Wonderful.
always the food than the shopping. And one time I came home with 13 pairs of shoes in one luggage. What I brought over from Singapore, I would say, I don't know. I guess a little bit of my Singapore, culture, my Singapore tradition, and my Singapore Singlish, I would say. Like all the las and all the little jargons and lingos. But
As a Singaporean back home, you probably spoke more English than Chinese.
well, depending on who I speak to. If I speak to my mother, would be Mandarin and Cantonese, and my mother tongue Hakka. But with
Oh, so
that,
you've got 4 languages.
Cantonese and Hakka is considered Chinese dialects. It's not language.
Fair,
So Mandarin is my second language. But when I speak to Dad, it would be English and Hakka.
At school, what did you study? Did you study Chinese or was school in English?
English is the first language, definitely, and because I am Chinese heritage, so Chinese would be my second language in school.
With your son here in Australia, do you speak English or Chinese or both?
English only. English only. My older son is blaming me for not educating him in Mandarin.
And how old is he now?
I've got two boys, 20 years old and 8 years old.
So if the 20-year-old went back to Singapore, it wouldn't help his Chinese, would it?
No, my mum would my mum actually struggled to communicate with him.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mandarin Chinese is vital. I'm of the view that every kid in Australia should be taught it, and Spanish, because then they have English, Spanish and Chinese to cover the world. Why is it that in Singapore so many of the people grow up with an English education as opposed to a Chinese parochial education?
Well, they do push it. They do push very hard to study second language, depending on your heritage. So if you are Chinese descent or Chinese heritage, they will get you to pick Mandarin as your second language in school. But if you are, say, Indian heritage, then Tamil as your second language. Now in Singapore, like I said, I've been away for 22 years, so I can only quote on what I know back then, is that if you got to pass your second language. So if you don't pass your second language, it's actually one of the requirements to get into university. So you find that a lot of Singaporeans would come to Australia to study because the second language is, probably like me, failed the second language. We can't get into university.
I would sacrifice Italian. I'm fluent in Italian to speak Chinese fluently.
Yes, I think that
It's
Mandarin.
so important.
Yeah.
It's so important.
I think Mandarin is actually a really good second language to pick up, to learn. That's what I foresee, that in the far future that Mandarin would be probably the next main language globally.
Do you use it much in your work here in Australia?
I do. I do struggle at the beginning, but I picked up quite a bit as I went along with my work. But so.
Now you work in the property sector. How long have you worked in property for?
I have been in the property management for the last 16 years.
So
Brisbane and Melbourne, yes. So I have my license in Queensland as well as my license here in Victoria.
property is something that obsesses and grips this nation at every level. Tell us more about what you do in the property field.
I am in property management, that's rentals, where I help property investors manage their properties, from leasing the property to renters, all the way in looking after the rent collection and maintenance, and all the way through their real estate journey.
Local and international?
Yes.
Where are some of your international owners from?
Some would be from in China, and some would be from Malaysia, as well as one owner, she has relocated to LA in the States. So I look after her property here.
Under Foreign Investment Review Board regulations, what are international individuals allowed to own in this country?
Anything.
Literally anything?
Everything.
So the properties you manage for the people overseas, are they apartments? Are they townhouses?
The one that lives in LA, it used to be her residence, all right, her place of residence, and I think due to work, and she just relocated to LA, and now she has it as a property investment. So she's Aussie, so there's no requirement whatsoever there. But I have overseas owners who bought a property here in the Point Cook area, and they live in China. So I do not know what sort of legality or requirements they have to jump through to attain an investment property here. But as long as we do our due diligence to make sure that they are the property owners on the title before we agree to manage our property.
In this program, a lot of people listen from overseas. A lot of people listen locally as well. And it's all about migrating to Australia. So one of the reasons we wanted to have you on, Grant and I, to have you on, is because it's very hard when you come to a new country to know how to rent a property. And you represent landlords. So can you give us a few clues, a few secrets on what makes a good renter? What does a landlord want in a renter?
Well, first of all, a good quality renter. Rent is paid on time every single time, keeps the place clean, and most of all, the landlord always like to look for longevity. And I know it's quite common to ask for a 12-month lease. So if we can say negotiate on an 18-month lease or even a 2-year lease, that is longevity to the property owner, and so it's win-win for everybody.
So if a mum or a dad from Singapore rang and said, my daughter is coming to Monash University to do a Bachelor of Biomedical Science and a Doctor of Medicine, she'll be here for 6 years, that'd be a dream client?
That would be a dream client, definitely. And so if she is going to be a full-time student, and we can always get the parents to be the guarantor, and yes, that would be definitely a dream client for the landlord. Longevity,
that's the key. And how do people who are not familiar with the processes, how do they get to you, or who do they get to rent a property? How do they arrive? They're in an Airbnb for a week or two till they get their bearings around Australia. Their course starts in a couple of weeks. How do they rent?
Well, if they can always inquire the properties here in Melbourne from where they are, from overseas, because these days we have properties, not only do they have the images on the listing, on the advertisement, they also have the virtual tour. So before COVID, I would say before the pandemic, you got to be there in person to inspect the property before you can apply or have somebody to represent you. But because of the pandemic, we all come up with new innovations to work around things. So as long as you agree to accept the property via the virtual tour that you have just seen online, or when we do the FaceTime, we can go around the property, walk through the property on FaceTime or even on WhatsApp video, and you accept the property as it is, that we can still lease it out while you're still overseas.
That's interesting, Grant. When I've rented before, you've rented, and it almost sounds easier in a way, yet it's not, is it?
Oh, so many things I'm tempted to say, David. I
Then
mean,
you have to edit them out, Grant.
look,
Because
I'm wondering if there's already informal networks that exist with native language speakers, like Chinese language speakers, Singaporean expats, Chinese expats, Indian expats. I'm sure there are informal networks which make securing property much easier for some sectors of the community than, to be honest, than if I rocked up to an estate agent to rent a property.
Well, I've got to confess, that's a great point. When I worked as a journalist in London, guess where I lived?
Somewhere that an Australian
Earl's
pointed
Court.
you to.
Earl's Court, yeah. Yeah.
That contacts that you had helped you out. That's the way of the world. So it's always been thus, and it's just like now we talk about properties. Really interesting. The only young people who can buy properties basically financed
by mum and
their
dad,
parents or their extended family.
Here and overseas. That's.
It's always been a class thing. It always will be a class thing. I don't think there's any point pushing the barrow, but people just need to be realistic about it. If you don't have parents overseas who can guarantee your rent and you arrive here and you are faced with the same situation as an Australian high school graduate without parent access to capital or collateral, you'll struggle to find somewhere to live.
Now,
That's
talking
just
about
life.
places to live and struggling with places to live, because you've been in Brisbane and in Melbourne, anybody listening, are there suburbs that you would advise international students, skilled migrants, not to live in for safety issues, purely for safety issues?
Look, in Brisbane, no, everywhere
Woodridge.
you go.
I lived in Brisbane, Logan and Albert, parts of Logan and Albert Shire, when I lived in Brisbane, were basically war zones, and I don't think it's changed much. When I say war zones, there was a lot of gang violence and whatnot. Now, where I live in Melbourne, it's quite similar. When the council goes and plants 300 trees, 3 days later, they're all snapped in half because that's where the gangs are out just fooling around. So there are places
there are places. I live in Brisbane for 14 years, and I have been to most of the suburbs, right? Because as being in doing property management, it takes you places. And certain places, when I drive through, I unconsciously I'll just turn around and lock my car door. Yes, there's some areas that are quite rough, and I've been chased down by a tenant before, and I wouldn't want to go back there. It's not a place for a single lady to walk by yourself.
It's very important.
Yeah, it is very important. So make sure that you do your due diligence and do your research.
The reason I ask is because what Grant was talking about, informal networks, intracultural networks, certain ethnic groups congregate and live in certain sectors of the city. And there are suburbs. I'll never tell anyone where to go to school if they're asking me what a good university is. I'll tell them where not to go. And I think it should be the same with suburbs. Would you, if someone said to you, Grant, I'm a 21-year-old woman, I'm going to do a 6-year medical degree, where should I live?
Well,
you tell her where not to live.
no, I think so. You jump to the sort of cultural division, but I think it's more often, and it always is, a class division. So if you want to feel safe, go and live amongst people who are safe and secure. If
you're at Melbourne Uni, live in Carlton, live in Parkville.
And whatnot.
If you're at the University of Queensland, live in St Lucia.
Or Indooroopilly. Well, again, Brisbane, so many places in Brisbane are amazing.
Oh, it's a beautiful city. I love Brisbane. I love it.
And I talked about Woodridge and Albert and whatnot, but then again, it's not every street. I live in one of those places that historically has been a rough suburb. But now, a double block down the road from me sold for nearly $5 million.
That's a lot of money.
So when I grew up and was making jokes about my suburb when I was 25, now those mostly migrant families who settled there have now become super wealthy because of the growth, big blocks and nobody wanted to live there when I was in my teens. So I'm sure that's happening all over.
I've gone the cultural angle because I moved to an Australian suburb when I was in London, and a lot of my clients moved to suburbs where Mandarin is spoken, where Hindi is spoken, and it's a comfort. But that's a wonderful asset to have people of your own background to support you. But I also want to let people who are listening know where it's not safe to go.
I don't think you can define that because
it's very hard to define and it's fluid
because
it changes.
Well, the area I live in Melbourne, it quite often features on the news with someone's been shot, someone's been stabbed, blah blah blah. But that's all internal family stuff. So nobody knows how mental your neighbours are, but let's not mislead people. It's very rare that anybody, male or female, will be walking down the street and will suffer any kind of adverse effect.
Melbourne's very safe. Sydney...
late nights.
Could be anywhere.
It changes.
Yeah.
And there's just basic precautions. Gee, whenever I travel, people, David, you go somewhere and someone will go, oh, be careful, don't go that suburb, don't go down that road.
That's right.
So, it sounds like my mother.
But if you do the sensible things, you don't get affected by alcohol or drugs and stagger around on your own, carrying things that are worth a lot of money. Well, most people aren't going to have a go at you. One thing I was told when I arrived in the Philippines was don't wear an expensive watch. Yeah. And also be very careful about your backpack because they're soft targets.
And what's that zone? Just near, not Quezon.
The green zone in Makati.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, that's where all the expats and the diplomats and everyone
that's high street crime
and shop.
So high pickpocket.
So if you're going to go and smash and grab something, why do all the smash and grabs happen along the St Kilda foreshore in the summertime? Because everyone's driven in from Melbourne and Hawthorn and Mount Waverley and Blackburn to go to the beach.
Left their mobile phones on the dashboard.
Yeah.
That's it.
Or I'll put it under the seat. No one will know it's there.
Wendy, tell me, what are suburbs that are, all right, we'll look at the flip side. What are the suburbs that are great to be in? The majority of your investors, where do they invest in? Which suburbs?
Well, I saw the trend where, because I know a couple of landlords or even like immigration consultants where they try to help their clients over to migrate to Australia. They tend to go for what Grant was just mentioning, that they tend to go for where that community that congregates. Right? So if you're coming from, say, the Southeast Asia, they would like to look for places around Box Hill, Box Hill South, Glen Waverley. Yeah,
Surrey Hills.
Yeah.
Beautiful. Lovely suburbs, very expensive suburbs.
Oh, and then if you're coming from, say, from Iran and, those areas, they would probably like to look at Doncaster East, Templestowe, Doncaster itself. So you can know where all the little congregations are. And for the Greeks and all that, if you're coming from Greece, probably they look at Oakley. Oakley South. So if you think, okay, maybe I say, all right, I'm going to, migrate to where my mini country there in Melbourne, and just to feel safe and just kind of get their bearings right and talk to their own people in their own language where they feel comfortable, and then they just slowly will venture out of there.
That's interesting about those decisions are either short-term or long-term. Nobody who is investing in Doncaster or Blackburn South is investing in short-term.
No.
But somebody who is buying an apartment in Docklands or up here at the top end of the city might be thinking, we'll buy it for 4 years or 5 years while the student does their study, and then we'll cash out and get into somewhere else. So property is never simple, because everybody's got a different desire for what they want out of that. It's an investment, but it's also a basic need. You have to live somewhere. So
Your investors fit both categories Grant's talking about, short-term and long-term?
Well, yeah, we have landlords, or should I say, sometimes I get a call from just a prospective landlord looking for only 6 months, and because they're only going away, they want to pack their bags and just go on a caravan and hitch and try to discover Australia's backyard, and they only wanted to just lease it out fully furnished for 6 months. And so anything that is less than 3 months, that will be under Airbnb. But yeah, so of course that we also have the long term. Now we're not coming back. We are living in London, and this is just going to be 100% investment.
Wendy, put the crystal ball on the table and tell us suburbs that you believe are going to be exciting suburbs to invest in, or for people coming to live in.
Oh, I wish I have the crystal ball to tell you where is affordable and where is not. But the thing is, it's just you got to feel your element. The moment you get here, you got to feel whether you are more of a north side person or the southeast person or west. So for me, I'm always a southeast person. So I tried living in the north. It just didn't sit well with me. So I can tell you where, but I wouldn't tell you where. But the thing is all individual. And also looking at what you are looking for, your requirements, your lifestyle, whether you're going to be working close to the city or whether you're going to be working on really down south. So do you want to travel 45 minutes on a highway or not? So there's a lot of factors to consider before you look for your accommodation or your next home. Yeah.
Grant, tell me.
yeah, what would you like me to add to that, David?
I think Wendy covered that beautifully. But you're a west person. I've been a north person. I've been a southeast person. What's Doncaster? North, west? Northeast.
Doncaster, I still think that it's on the Monash Highway, so more like a southeast.
When I was a baby in primary school, kindergarten, I was in Doncaster, and it was fields. Not anymore, is it?
Sorry?
Doncaster's not fields anymore. It's built up. It used to be country land.
No, not anymore. No, it's so nice. It's such a good feel to it.
But even when we were at school, David, those suburbs were established suburbs of middle-class, solid families. Like the parents of the people you went to school with were either living in those suburbs or aspiring to live in those suburbs. Now it's another generation on. Those people are probably downsizing or have retired to the Gold Coast or wherever, and perhaps those properties have been passed on to younger families or have been sold into a new demographic of middle-class people. Nobody who's just trying to get established without, as we said before, the benefit of the house, the bank of mum and dad, is moving to those suburbs. So I think we talk about this a lot in this podcast, in that Australia is a very expensive place to live. And
in every way it is.
And you need to be aware of that and have aspirations that are consistent with that. If you have a high asset backing and you have a high salary, things are fantastic here.
Did that shock you, Wendy? And Grant raises a beautiful and important point. It is very expensive to live here. What do your clients say when they come here? Are they surprised at the cost of living?
Okay, because like I can compare. Like coming from Singapore, and I lived in Singapore for 27 years and we've been here for 22 years, so I have a comparison. The cost of living in Singapore is much lower than here, all right? But when you consider the price of property, is so much more expensive in Singapore. So we can always compare to the house come home. So what are we comparing? Are we comparing like overall? Overall, is the cost of living in Australia is it higher? Yeah, overall, definitely Australia is a little bit more expensive than Singapore. But when it comes to property, it's so much cheaper here compared to Singapore. Yes,
but it's cheaper comparatively. It's not cheaper for an Australian. If you're an Australian earning $45,000 a year,
it can be very hard,
and you want to buy a 3-bedroom house and you cannot get somebody else to either guarantee the loan or provide the deposit for you, forget it, because you now have to stump up 20% as a deposit. That's pretty standard for people who do not have asset backing. So how many people who are renting a house now, living a sort of normal life, running a car, can save 20% of $1.2 million or $2 million to buy a property in any of these suburbs we've been talking about?
Is it asset backing and professional? Doctors, people who migrate as doctors get, 10% they have to pop up?
Not turn up as a doctor and you don't have an ongoing contract and you're not earning. What does a doctor earn? I don't even know what a...
Depends.
What's a doctor you're not a doctor until you've done 5 years.
A general practitioner would earn a nice 6-figure salary.
Okay, no problem.
The professionals only have to have 10% stump up, don't they?
Well, it comes down to what you are earning and what your backing is. Yeah. And somebody who is earning that is not remotely in the same ballpark as someone who works as a factory hand.
How do we educate people coming here? How do we make them aware of that? Because when they come to realise this, it's often too late. What do we do how do we make that easier for people? How do we educate them about the expense of property in Australia? What do we do?
I think we're at a change in one of those flex points in society. Everybody has aspired to own their own property. That's been like the Australian mantra for 50 years, 60 years. But now we're moving more to the European way
of rental,
where you might buy a block of land where you go and spend your holidays that's 300 kilometres from the city, and that's your property. Yeah. The rest of the time, you rent and live where you want to for the lifestyle or for the economic reasons or whatever. In Paris, you don't expect to own where you live.
Be nice if you did,
but it's just not a thing. All those shows we watch in all the British things, they're all council flats, they're all council tenancies. You don't own, in most cases, in the cities, you don't own the property.
Do people, when they come to Australia, know how expensive it is and how difficult it is to secure finance to purchase?
I'm not very well versed in the purchasing side of things, but I can definitely prepare them or give them advice how to prepare themselves for rentals. If they're looking to come to Australia for whatever the reason is, but in terms of like purchasing as an investor, that is something that I can't comment.
But you've got a network you refer to.
Yes, I do.
And they're multilingual.
Oh,
so people who are listening who wanted to talk to you.
Definitely.
Yeah.
I definitely have a lot of contacts in that, and they'll be able to help them.
And it's not hard to buy property if you've already got money, right? So that's the dichotomy.
Correct. Correct.
It's not difficult if you have the backing and you have a secure income that is regular and it's average or above. But you have to have that backing to begin.
I think that they might have. The government might have some requirements as an overseas investor to invest here in Australia. So I think it comes under the business visa or something like that. Look, I'm not too sure, but I know that there might be some requirement as to how if you want to buy a property here, in Australia or even in Melbourne. There is a requirement.
Do people who want to rent, they come with reference letters from overseas, do reference checks as the property manager of people from overseas? How do you verify an overseas reference letter?
Well, it is hard. Well, the thing is, it is hard to do a overseas rental reference. So what we look at is, first of all, we probably get their visa to make sure that the visa is all legitimate. And we also do our background checks and doing their tenancy database to make sure that they are not bankrupt or whatsoever and all that, just to give the landlord peace of mind. And also a copy of any income or even bank statements to see that they are able to service the rent. But in terms of rental reference from overseas, we might be able to do that if you are able to speak the language and that you're able to call the overseas line, but we don't usually do that. We'll just do our background check through their passport number or even a driver's license number or whatsoever. Yeah.
Skilled workers listening in Thailand, Vietnam, Italy, United States, they've got their visas, the borders are open so they can come to Australia. How quickly is the process executed? The application, rental property, the granting of the signing of the lease from start to finish, how long does it take to actually get a property in Australia, or does it depend?
Well, depending from agency to agency, but with my agency, Home Run Realty, the moment they submit the application, making sure that they have all their documents all intact, and the turnaround time is usually 24 hours.
Are there any red lights, any alarms, tripwires? What will not get you a rental property in Australia? Somebody who's had visas rejected multiply. Would somebody on a bridging visa waiting to go to review get a rental property? Somebody who'd had a visa rejected?
Or we will be able to find out. We will be able to find out what sort of visa, what class are they in, what class of visa they have.
But a visa rejected and it's going to be a year and a half till they get to review, and then it'll either be yes, they win at review or they lose at review. Will you touch people who've had visas rejected?
Well, I still need to present it to the landlord. Any application that comes through, always lay out on the table to let the landlord know. And anything that kind of like send alarm bells, I definitely highlight to the landlord. And if there's only 1 year on the visa for them, and we can just say, all right, we can lease it up for a year, and then we won't renew that lease if he's due to go home.
And what's the expectation of a landlord under the rules? How many months in advance, or how many months? Is it a month at the front and a month at the end, or what are the rules for the deposit?
Oh, for the
payment
bond?
to secure the property for the bond.
Oh, for the bond, well, the new legislation has to roll out on the 29th of March of this year that if the rent is $900 per week, you can only ask for 1 month's bond. Yeah. Which is equivalent to 1 month of rent. If anything that's more than $900 per month, then you can ask for more.
Dad is a media tycoon in Haiti, Hawaii, Honolulu. He's got millions of dollars. Can he pay for his adult child to study? Can he pay for the whole lease up front?
Oh, yeah, he can. Yeah, he can. Yeah, definitely. The landlord will kiss his feet. Yes, that definitely. Yeah.
Grant's biting his tongue. Grant wants to say something.
I rest my case.
Money talks.
Yeah.
And as a landlord, of course, you jump at that because as a landlord, it's an investment. And that's one of the things that's gone a bit cockeyed in Australia. Most people who own one property in Australia own more than 3. And I think it might even be edging up to 5. So that gives this home ownership and whatnot in Australia myth, just sinks it. We have look, I sound like I'm a raving bloody commo,
Nothing wrong with that.
But we often don't talk about the facts about economics in Australia because all the banks rely on property being good. Real estate's a huge industry. There are a lot of people who rely on all the signals being positive. And seriously, the system doesn't really care about Paul and Bridget from Broadmeadows who are in their late 30s who have never been able to buy a house. Nobody's trying to help them out. What they're trying to help, and who all these schemes are for, Bryony and David from Malvern who are moving out, and mummy and daddy are giving them the deposit. That all of the schemes biased.
In terms of, you've had 16 years in...
16 years
16
in
years.
property management.
We've got to finish up with your best tenant and your worst tenant, and not telling where they're from or what gender they are or what age they are. How was your best tenant, and how was your worst tenant, your worst tenant?
Well, best tenant. I always build a really good rapport with all my renters and even my landlords, of course. And we never try to differentiate that, or just because they are renters, they can afford to buy, and so they belong to this category. Nah, you just do not know what everybody's story is, right? Everybody has got a story. So they rent for many reasons. They don't want to buy for many reasons, and you respect that. So when you can actually have that mindset, you will build a really good rapport with your renters. So I have had renters in the past that now has become, because of the relationship we have built over time, and a couple of renters now has become my clients. So they became now my landlords, because when they can see that I've been treating them really well as a renter, they go, "Hey, Wendy, by the way, I have an investment property." I said, "Wow, okay, how can I help you?" You see? So always rule number one, never look down on renters. And well, back to your question, David, my worst tenant would be, this is back in Brisbane many moons ago, during one of my many routine inspections. I walked into the master bedroom just doing my rounds, and all of a sudden I found out that they were cultivating marijuana.
The only way they could afford the rent.
Were you privy to the electricity bill? That would have been crazy.
Well, thankfully, the electricity bill wasn't included in the rent. Thankfully, that was separate, so the tenants paid for that. But yeah, I was shocked.
Some serious stuff, yeah.
Oh yeah. So those are the many things that you just cross the box. You just got if any rental reference comes up from these people, I just have to tell the truth. But yeah, so
You've almost spent half your life in Australia now. If we went back 22 years, would you come to Brisbane and then to Melbourne and do it all again the same way?
Oh yes, definitely, hands down, yes.
Ringing endorsement.
I love it. Wendy, thanks for coming to the Migrating to Australia podcast. You've been fantastic.
Thank you, David. Thank you, Grant, for having me.
Thanks so much for being part of the Pravda and Communist Manifesto.
Here we speak the truth.
And look, listeners, you can't see it, but Wendy's got red hair. So we'll make a pinko como of her yet. If somebody has some landlord issues, some property issues, some rental issues when they arrive here to become an international student or a migrant,
or a partner on a partner visit, they go to Wendy Chong. And how does Wendy? Let's give you a free plug. Phone, fax, email, name of your business.
Don't give your phone number out, Wendy.
I give mine out because that's how I get contacted. But no, your business, where it is.
I'm more than happy to help. My name is Wendy Chong from Home Run Realty, and my number is 0412 739 488.
And if they want to email you from overseas?
Wendy@homerunrealty.com.au.
Fantastic.
And if you're going to give Wendy a call from overseas, +61, and don't put that in front of the 4.
Very good.
Yeah, drop the 0.
And if you want to talk to me about immigration, the best way to get in touch is Twitter, direct message, David Bongiorno, one word, @David Bongiorno, DAVID BONGIORNO.
And bingo was his name. And of course, at Instagram, @David_A_C_Bongiorno.
So clunky and so late to Instagram, I pay the penalty.
And remember,
And what about if you want a
these have
podcast?
been opinions and general information, not specific legal or realtor advice.
And what about if people want a podcast, Grant?
If people want a podcast, grant at migratingtoaustralia.com, and that'd be really good. I could do with some Christmas cheer.
Yeah.
Hooroo, everybody.